Hi, anyone and everyone. Welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam, and today we're going to talk about the curse that Giles Corey put on Salem upon his death. I'm going to go through an incredibly brief explanation on what happened to Giles during the Salem witch trials, and then discuss the aftermath of this curse. This will definitely be a little bit of a shorter episode because there isn't a ton of in-depth information, but I do feel like the information that we have is really interesting. But before I get into it, I do want to take a quick moment to thank all of you. Having all of you come back and listen means the world for the show. And I do have a request with that. We've been so incredibly lucky to have our show listened to around the world. I ask that you just share one of your favorite episodes with a friend. I'd really love to see more countries in our analytics, and we have been listened to in nearly every single state, with the exception of Hawaii, Montana, New Mexico, and Wyoming. So if you have friends in those states who may enjoy our show, again, send them your favorite episode. Another huge way to help is to leave a review. The more reviews that we get from people who enjoy the show, the more it gets recommended to others. I don't want to go too long about this, but I just want to thank everybody, and I'm really excited to see the consistent growth that we've been having, and I would love to see even more. So let's go ahead, dive right into this episode. We're going to go back to 1611, which is the year Giles Corey was born in Northamptonshire, England. Sometime between 1640 and 1695, Giles would travel to Massachusetts and purchase a large plot of land for a farm. And it's kind of a big window there. He moved in within 19 years, but the records aren't terribly clear, and I've seen both 1640 reported and I've seen 1659 reported. So we're not entirely sure, but regardless, before moving to Massachusetts in England, he would marry a woman and have 4 children with her. And her name was Margaret. And I'm not entirely sure if they traveled to Massachusetts from England with him, but I kind of doubt it because Giles would marry again not long after leaving England. But after arriving in England, buying his farmland, which was in the south area of Salem Village, and he had a lot of land from the sound of it, and which gave him very much the image of being a prosperous farmer. He was also an active member of the village church and became friends with the Porter family in Salem. And the Porter family was well respected in Salem. And when the witch trials started, they did what they could to stop it. It was kind of the battle within the trial, the witch trials. The Porter family was very vocal. But Giles personally rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. He was known as being fairly selfish and would often do things solely for his own benefit instead of helping the community, which at this time, a lot of things were very community-based. You had to rely on each other. He also had a handful of run-ins with the law, and for the most part, it was for petty theft. He would steal food and tobacco, knives, basically really anything he had the ability to get his hands on, he would potentially steal it. And I'm sure this added to the perception of him being selfish because, again, he was a prosperous farmer. He had money. And in 1676, Giles was accused of much more serious events. Giles had apparently caught one of his indentured farmers, Jacob Goodale, of stealing apples from his brother-in-law. Even though Giles had been accused many times of stealing, this really had set him off. And he beat Goodale with a stick And 10 days after the beating, Giles sent Goodale to finally go receive medical attention because he was beaten so badly. And within a couple days of going to the doctor, Goodale died. And many people testified at Giles's trial saying that they witnessed him beating Goodale or that Giles had confessed to them. And at this time, it was legal to beat indentured servants. So the charges for Giles didn't stick, but he was fined for using excessive force. So this was a pretty big deal, but overall, people really kind of looked over it because the whole thing of being an indentured servant was that you were essentially working off a debt of some sort. Sometimes these were people who owed you money and they're working for you to just pay it off. Sometimes it was slaves. Kind of just depended on the different situations. But Giles's neighbor, John Proctor, who testified saying that Giles had confessed to him that he had killed Jacob Goodale, later accused Giles of burning down his house. Later, one of John Proctor's sons, who would actually confess to starting the fire, but it seems to me that they were trying to really just get Giles behind bars. Obviously, I'm just reading some historical records, but it seemed like a lot of people just didn't like him, so a lot of people accused him of different things, regardless if there was actual truth behind it or not. So taking him to trial for something that actually wasn't illegal, even though he had killed a man, and then accusing him of arson, which he was not involved in. It almost seems like they were kind of grasping at straws in an attempt to get him locked up. But Giles's second wife died in 1684, and again, he quickly remarried a woman named Martha. This was his third wife. And when the accusations of witchcraft began in Salem, Martha was very outspoken against the accusations and instead believed that the girls who began all the accusations, Elizabeth Parris, Abigail Williams, and Ann Putnam Jr., were lying. The people of Salem didn't like Martha's accusations, and this very quickly put a bigger target on the Coreys' backs, as there already had been. After being vocal about her thoughts, Martha had been accused of doing witchcraft by two of the three girls, going as far as saying that Satan himself had given Martha the power of witchcraft and told her to attack the girls. Martha would be arrested. At one point, Giles even testified against her. It doesn't sound like that he flat out accused her of being a witch, but he did mention that recently their farm animals had begun acting weird around Martha, and that Martha would occasionally wake up in the middle of the night and begin to pray. So he wasn't flat out saying, yes, my wife is a witch, but he's pointing out some things that he had noticed that he found as bizarre behavior. And just less than a month after Martha's arrest, Giles had also been arrested for witchcraft. A few more girls from Salem Village had accused him, in addition to the girls who had accused Martha. And as Giles was being questioned, the girls had an episode and said that Giles was currently doing witchcraft on them while in the courtroom. And to prevent him from doing any more witchcraft in the courtroom, the judge tied his hands behind his back. This is when Giles started to publicly agree with his wife and called the girls liars. But instead of pleading his innocence, Giles refused to offer a plea to the judge. And Giles knew exactly what he was doing. If he had entered a plea of guilty, he knew that his land would have been taken away from him and his sons, and they wouldn't be able to inherit it. And if he had pled not guilty, he knew that he would go to trial and likely be found guilty. Then again, his land would be taken from him and his family upon his execution. If he didn't enter a plea, the courts didn't really know what to do. A no contest plea wasn't a thing yet in the court of law. And not submitting a plea would mean that he didn't even have the ability to be tried. He couldn't go to court unless a plea was made. So even though he technically was in jail, they were unable to take his land from him, and they were unable to take him to court. Finally, after about 6 months of sitting in jail without giving the court a plea, they finally decided to attempt to get a forced plea out of Giles. He had been taken out of the jail to a field right next door to the jail, stripped him of his clothing, forced him to lie on the ground and bound his hands and legs, and Sheriff George Corwin placed a board over Giles and a number of large rocks on top of that board. They wanted to essentially torture him until he finally said he was guilty or not guilty. And in between each stone that they placed, they would ask Giles what his plea was, but he remained silent. Giles never even cried out in pain. And since he refused to speak, Sheriff Corwin started to become impatient. So he added more rocks. And at one point, he even sat on the board to add even more weight. A couple of days had gone by, and Giles still refused to offer a plea. And a crowd began to form and watch this horrifying spectacle. And at one point, so much weight was placed on Giles that his tongue was forced out of his mouth. And Sheriff Corwin used his cane to push it back in, which is horrifying. On September 19th, 1692, about 2.5 days after the pressing had begun, Giles realized he was going to be killed by the pressing very soon. And there's some mixed reports on exactly what happens here, but it is believed that Giles Corey potentially cursed Salem Village and the sheriff before saying, "More weight." And then additional rocks were placed on him, and those were the ones that had killed him. And as I mentioned, there's mixed reports on exactly what Giles Corey said before his death. 3 days after Giles's death, Martha would be hanged after she had pled not guilty but was found guilty in court, along with 7 other accused witches. And time would pass, and the witch trial hysteria would eventually fade away, but Giles's curse would stay in the back of people's heads. 4 years after Giles's death, Sheriff Corwin would die of a heart attack at age 30. And nearly immediately after Corwin's death, residents of Salem began to say that his death was a result of Giles Corey's curse. But in those 4 years after Giles's death and before Corwin's, Corwin did everything he could to seize Corey's property. Sheriff Corwin essentially lied to everyone, saying that he could seize the property, even though he technically couldn't at that point. And Giles's children would reluctantly hand it over, not knowing that this was technically illegal. They were trying to just do the right thing. They're told that they have to. But years after Corwin's death, in 1710, Giles's daughter Elizabeth and her husband John Moulton filed a lawsuit seeking damages. Elizabeth said in court, quote, "After our father's death, the sheriff threatened to seize our father's estate, and for fear we complied with him and paid him 11 pounds, 6 shillings in money." So while it doesn't seem like Corwin necessarily seized the land from the Corey's family, he minimally took their money, and 11 pounds and 6 shillings was a lot of money in the late 1600s. So let's backtrack just a little bit, back to the time when Sheriff Corwin died of the heart attack. A man named Philip English put a lien on Corwin's body, preventing him from being buried. Philip English and his wife Mary had been accused of being witches by Corwin, and really, no surprise here, Corwin seized English's assets. Philip was a local businessman and had a local trading company. He would trade fish for exotic fruit and European goods, and he was a very successful businessman. His company had grown to the point where he had 21 ships, 14 lots, and his own wharf in Salem. And from the sound of it, he was one of the main trading merchants in Salem. Philip and Mary would have 2 daughters, and in 1692, Philip would be elected as town selectman. Similar to the Coreys, Mary was first accused of witchcraft, and shortly after, Philip was also accused. Before Philip could be arrested, he fled to Boston in the hopes that he may be able to use his influence to get Mary's charges dropped. Unfortunately, Philip's absence had a negative impact on Mary's imprisonment, so he returned and was arrested himself. His connections did get him and Mary some extra privileges. They were able to be in jail together, and the jail was also willing to release them each morning to go about their day, only if they returned each night. A local minister who believed in their innocence arranged for the couple to escape together just before their trials. Mary and Philip left their daughters with family friends in Boston and made their way to New York to wait out the hysteria. They were getting fairly frequent updates on what was happening in Salem, and after hearing about a troublesome season with the crops and the lack of food in Salem, Philip didn't want the people that he cared about back in Salem to suffer, so he arranged a ship filled with corn to help them out and provide them with something. And in 1693, after the witch hunt hysteria had ended, Philip and Mary returned to Salem to discover that nearly all of their property and assets had been confiscated by Sheriff Corwin. Philip and Mary attempted to go back to their lives with what they had left. And Philip went back to his business, and a year after returning to Salem, Mary had died while giving birth to a son. And Philip had not forgiven Sheriff Corwin for his actions. So he kept fighting to get his belongings back for his family. Then when Sheriff Corwin died, Philip put a lien on his body and demanded that he be reimbursed for what Corwin had taken from him. And it's not clear how long this process took, but Philip eventually had been repaid. I kind of have the feeling it wasn't in full, but he did receive something. And the lien was lifted, allowing Corwin to be buried. But according to the book Haunted Salem, Strange Paranormal in the Witch City, Sheriff Corwin's wife was worried about burying him in the cemetery because he had become so hated in Salem. She believed that his grave would have been vandalized. And again, in this book, it says that he was buried in the basement of his home, which is now the Joshua Ward House, which is pretty prominent in Salem. And I will say, I went looking for more information on this to get additional sources, and I found many rumors about Sheriff Corwin torturing suspects in his home, but I didn't find anything about him being buried on the property. And I'll include it in our socials. He does have a gravestone. So that doesn't mean that he was buried in that spot, but there's no evidence other than this book that I had read that is telling me that he was buried on the property, which is now the Joshua Ward House. And so all of this so far doesn't necessarily sound like a curse. Sheriff Corwin was one of the biggest players in the Salem witch trial hysteria, and those he accused hated him. But the supposed curse of Giles Corey goes way beyond Sheriff Corwin. In 1974, so we're jumping a couple hundred years in the future, Robert Ellis Cahill was elected sheriff of Salem. And Cahill was born and raised in Salem, and he loved learning about the area's history. He had published many books about the area, and he was also known to have a great interest in shipwrecks and would often go on diving trips to explore the wreckages. Cahill also started 2 museums within Salem after purchasing a ton of mannequins for $250. He urged the town to purchase an old church and convert it into the Salem Witch Museum, which is exactly what the town did. The Salem Witch Museum is still a staple within Salem and is directly across the street from the Salem Common. And when I was there, I didn't make it to the museum, but it was also mid-October and there were lines around the block. So that was something that we skipped on our trip just to make sure that we weren't sitting in line for hours. But he had also created the New England Pirate Museum in the 90s. And this would be after his tenure as sheriff, but it just shows that he really loved his community and he loved the history around his community. And from what I've read about Sheriff Cahill, he was very well respected in Salem. And so much of its tourism and main income of the town comes from historical tourism, and having a sheriff that values its history and looks for ways to embrace it, both good and bad, is a huge asset to Salem. But in 1978, 4 years after being elected to sheriff, Cahill suffered a severe heart attack and stroke, and he would learn after this that he has a rare blood condition, which is the reason that he ended up having to retire as sheriff a short time after this heart attack and stroke. But this inspired Cahill to look into the legend of the Giles Corey curse. And he learned that for as many generations as he had the ability to research, all the sheriffs in Salem's history seemed to have a heart or blood conditions, or they had died in office. And it's his theory that there may actually be something to the curse. Unfortunately, Cahill would die unexpectedly in 2005, and it doesn't seem like a cause of death has been made public, but he was 70 years old at the time of his death. So unfortunately, I don't know much more, but numerous articles had said that there was no cause of death. So there's a website called Factology that did a write-up on the curse, and this very much seems to be a blog, so I'm not sure how well vetted all of the information is, but the write-up seems fairly thorough, although there was a link to a website that supposedly has historical records from Ipswich, nearby to Salem. And when I went to go check out the site, it actually is a property and realty site. So either at the time of the post, when the post was published, the website was active with historical records, or something fishy might be going on. All I'll say is that this post seems like to have taken a good amount of time to create, and they have some screenshots of these historical records. So I'm going to use it as a reference, but I also understand that some of this information I have not been able to verify with other sources. So take it with a grain of salt, but I do find what they have in there quite interesting. So with that all being said, the author says that they have also dug into the historical records, and they have not found the same sort of information that Cahill found. They believe that the curse causing the sheriffs to have heart or blood issues, or causing the sheriffs to die in office, is just not real. Like, full stop, not real. They list all of the sheriffs since Sheriff Corwin, and how long they were sheriff, when they retired, and when they died, and if possible, a cause of death. Many of which retired and died at a very normal age. And another part of the theory is that the curse no longer exists because the sheriff's office was moved out of Salem to nearby town Middleton in the 90s. So once Salem no longer had a sheriff's department, apparently that is what had broken the curse. So, things aren't fully lining up based on the information that this blog post had provided. But another aspect of the curse is that Giles Corey can be seen shortly before and shortly after a disaster in Salem. In 1914, Salem experienced the Great Salem Fire, and the fire started at a leather factory and grew very quickly. 22 different fire departments from eastern Massachusetts responded to the fire, and it grew to be about a half mile wide and a mile and a half long. Apparently, Giles Corey had been seen in the cemetery where he was pressed to death before and after the fire. But I want to get into some facts about the conditions before the fire. While the specific cause of the fire is not known, Salem was in a drought at this time. And knowing that it started at a leather factory, there are many materials used at the factory that are highly flammable. So it's pretty understandable if a fire had started at this factory that it could have spread widely and quite fast. And this part of the curse is usually a pretty small paragraph at the end of many of the articles that I've read. And nearly all of the articles that I read that had mentioned this part of the curse, but they don't really go into many more details. They mention the Great Salem Fire, but they're not really mentioning other events or disasters within Salem's history where it is believed to have seen him in the cemetery. So, kind of overall, do I believe in the Giles Corey curse? No, I don't. Do I think that as a society, we have finally come to realize what was done to Giles Corey and all of the other accused witches is horrific? And over time, we look for excuses for negative things that happen to us as a society. And it's easy to blame a curse for it all. Yeah, I think that's probably more of what it is. And it's dramatic and scary in kind of a fantastical way. But if I'm going to review this as a curse that lasted over 300 years, I don't really believe that. I don't think that there's enough that I've been able to come across, at least, to put some weight on it. But I love Salem. It is one of my favorite places that I've ever been to. I find its history fascinating and tragic and horrific. But I do not believe that history lingers there today in the form of Giles Corey's ghost getting his retribution. But that's really kind of all I have for you today. Again, I'm sorry that this episode is pretty short. It's been a very chaotic life outside of the show for me lately. But I really want to give you all something kind of a little extra fun for spooky season and something that's not necessarily your typical topic. I know a lot of people just discuss the Salem witch trials, but I thought this might be a little bit of a twist on it. But thank you all for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? If you liked this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. You can find us on YouTube at Have You Heard About This Case, on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, on TikTok at HYHATC, or you can email us at haveyouheardaboutThisCase@gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll talk to you later.